as the city's service cost. The district maintains the current rural development pattern, allowing for a broad range of agricultural and natural resource-related uses while restricting residential development. It goes on to further describe allowed uses and development standards. It should be limited to accessory residential development as part of a commercial, agriculture, or natural resource use, not just traditional farms. The criteria for determining when an accessory residential use is permitted should be based on updated standards that take into account the economic realities of today's commercial agricultural activities, including outside sources of income and part-time and small-scale commercial operations. Residential development may also be part of a commercial recreation use. Further, development standards. The basic residential density standard for the current Ag RP zoning district should be maintained. The standards for the development of accessory residential units should provide greater flexibility in the siting of those units. I think this is what Eric was talking about earlier in terms of trying to implement this development standard. They should also encourage flexibility in the location and size of the lot, allow for a waiver of road frontage requirements, and allow access from a private driveway. So these are the highlights of the comprehensive plan. There are probably a few other small text items that could be discussed, but to highlight some, yeah.
I think a couple of the sections Audrey covered almost every single one of them of the comp plan relating to the discussion we've been having in the ag zone. The two, I think, sort of overriding concepts of the comp plan that influence how we move forward in this is that the future land use plan that we have does reaffirm a central policy of prior land use planning. That development in Auburn should grow out from the core and older established neighborhoods, but it also recognizes that there's a strong desire to preserve and enhance the agricultural heritage of Auburn, and that in order to do that, it's necessary to one, still have single-family homes or residential uses accessory to agriculture was one of the desires of the plan, but also recognizes that we need to base that on updated criteria, that the 50% rule just doesn't work in today's modern agricultural world. So I think those two key points are a good summary of the very challenging public policy issue that's now in the board's hands that the ag committees have been wrestling with over the last year.
So many of you are familiar with some of these map graphics. This one depicts our rural farm land coverage. We have one of these for the north area and again for the central area. This just gives a snapshot of land use, and that in fact the comprehensive plan has been implemented, and the development pattern that was envisioned from the 1920s to the 1950s to the 1980s to the present has somewhat worked. And when you look at the actual numbers, I believe we have in this table, and you might be able to help me with this a little bit more, but in this table we have a total of
about 20,000 acres in the agricultural zone for total acreage. And these maps and tables are more intended to be examples of the types and maps and tables that we have available. There's a lot of data on the ag portal. We can talk specifically about some of these, but we wanted to sort of show you the type of information we have. We could spend probably multiple hours going through if we went through one by one. But all of these other data points and maps that go along with the data points are available on the hub. I think one of the interesting things that came out of this data table is at the top here, the top zoning district, you'll see the ag zone about 20,000 acres, about 19,000 after you remove right-of-ways and some other things, but 74% of it, based on this analysis, was forested, which was something that surprised some of the people on the committee. And then we also tried to quantify the low-density country residential and rural residential zoning districts. Those as well are substantially forested, with rural residential being 61% forested, but those are large lot residential zoning districts that also allow for almost every agricultural use that's allowed in the ag zone.
So interestingly enough, we were interviewed by Bates College students, was it last week? A week ago, looking at food scarcity studies, and in the meeting that I had with them, I was reviewing the zoning ordinance and essentially said farming is allowed in almost every single zone in the city. So anyone who wants to farm, there's nothing preventing you. But that was a great talk from Bates College, and we'll be interested to see what they come up with. So moving along in our stats and facts and maps section here, this is a breakdown that was completed recently that looks at vacant parcels, less than 10 acres with 250 feet of road frontage, occupied parcels of 20 acres or more, or less than 20 acres, and the vacant parcels less than 3 acres with any road frontage, landmark parcels within the ag zone, parcels with no frontage in ag zone, possible frontage in other zones, vacant or occupied parcels that don't meet dimensional standards, and other parcels, and all of these are in the ag zone. This was an attempt by staff to break down all the possible combinations so we have a better understanding of just what is out there in the ag zone and what combinations from lot size to occupation. This information is also available on the portal.
As the committee had started to shell out the draft that the council forwarded to the planning board, we were starting to ask questions about how many lots are there greater than 3 acres but less than 10, how many are there 10 acres but less than 20 that could never be split based on the 10-acre lot size, and how many lots are there over 20 acres with more than double the required frontage. So that we've started to try to quantify that here. We'll have additional mapping if the planning board wants to use that as the process moves forward.
So that summarizes where we're at in terms of the comprehensive plan summary, our resources. Again, the agricultural portal, we can access this to get answers to many questions or to review maps as our conversation or discussion requires. My understanding is that there are members here potentially from the previous ad hoc committee for agriculture from the 2017-2018. We do have an executive summary that we have distributed to the planning board. If you would like to speak to the planning board at this time, to summarize your work, just to complete our history before moving forward.
Yeah, so I guess we're inviting, Mayor Levesque informed me that we would have some members representing that committee. When I found that out, I asked him, and I hope he passed this along to you, I asked him if you could sort of give us a framework. What would be most helpful for us is understanding what were the goals, what was the framework that you worked in? Were you working with the comprehensive plan? Were you working with other documents? And sort of how did you come to your decisions? And I know that's a lot to ask. I'm not asking for an incredibly comprehensive answer to that question, but sort of to help us understand how you landed at the executive summary that we were looking at. So please come forward. And Mr. Walker, were you also, no, okay. All right.
Point of order?
Yes.
I was on the Mayor's Action Group Committee. Is that the committee you're referring to?
Mr. Gray, that is the summary that we got, and that's the summary that I apologize if I misspoke. I'm looking specifically for input from a member of the Action Committee, the most recent committee. I apologize.
The summary that you provided was from the first committee, not the second committee.
I apologize. I hope that you've gotten all of the copies that we got, but we got copies of, I believe, more than one. We got copies of the original Ag Committee that conducted the study, right, as well as from the Ad Hoc Committee, not the Action Committee.
And the executive summary was from the initial one.
Okay.
What you have from
okay.
the
All right.
most recent committee is the draft ordinance.
Okay. Yes, please.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the planning board.
Other members of the committee to sit with Mr. Moore? Or just Mr. Moore?
Room will.
Need another table.
No.
Well, so this is my concern. I understand that this is an incredibly contentious issue. Can you please provide input when Mr. Moore is done? Can you please provide gaps or holes that you believe Mr. Moore has left in the narrative around how the Mayor's Action Committee came to its executive summary?
Afterwards.
Is that?
So,
That's fair.
It's just interesting
okay.
that none of the members of this committee were asked
no,
to provide a summary.
I didn't ask the committee. I have not invited anyone. Mr. Levesque informed me that there would be someone available to speak. I asked him to ask that individual to specifically speak to the narrative of how that executive summary was developed. I think I'm being incredibly fair, considering that you've interrupted my meeting, that I'm saying I would like to hear from you after. And I'm sort of perplexed that you are upset that I am saying that I want to hear from you after. So if you could please wait until Mr. Moore is done, and then we are interested in hearing any of the gaps or holes that you believe are there, and we want to hear that information. I want us to act civilly. Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the planning board. My name is Peter Moore. I'm a landowner. I own a large piece of land on the Jordan School Road and the Pownell Road. Just for the record, I'm a member of the Mayor's Action Committee on Agriculture and Resource Protection. I'd like to share some sense of the process that our group used to arrive at the group's various conclusions, resolutions, and suggestions. And those all were focused on the primary topics which the staff members, Eric and his colleague, just
those topics being the lot size and
the 50% income test, the minimum lot size, and then those were the two largest, and then there were some other.
Are they, if they are part of the summary, we asked specifically because we want to understand why that executive summary came to be. So if there's something else that you think was important that led to the executive summary, we'd like to hear it.
I will, yeah. So we were guided by the comprehensive plan, the more recent so-called consultants report. I can't remember the name of the consulting firm, but I know, Eric, you know who that is. And then the findings of the so-called ad hoc committee on the ag zone, which preceded the Mayor's Action Group convening their group. Primary among the issues were addressing the so-called 50% income test, the 10-acre minimum lot size. Both represent, I believe, most of the people on our group, were in agreement that they represented impediments to really more active use of the agricultural resource within the community, and that for the most part, the 50% income test was pretty much a non-starter for anyone wishing to farm a piece of land and live on that land at the same time. Of importance is the fact that the state of Maine has several programs to encourage agriculture, forestry, and open space preservation, and those programs, which include tree growth, tax designation, provide incentives for landowners to designate their land and use it in accordance with those programs to reduce their tax burden and have them be more use-oriented of the land.
So is it fair to say that you bring that up because you wanted more individuals to be able to take advantage of those programs, or?
No, there was discussion at one of the meetings, and I'll get into the protocol of the meetings in a few minutes here, but I only bring it up because there were concerns raised during the group's various meetings about tax consequences, and it was and the issue was, or the fact was stated that there are various plans to help protect people against just, tax inflation, if you will. Okay. The group conducted itself in a series of, I think it was 7 or 8 meetings over about 3 or 4 months. We probably met in public forum for about 25 hours. Collectively, some of the meetings were as many as 4 hours long. We had representatives from the city council, the planning board, business owners, landowners, farmers, citizens in the community. There were 8 members on the group, and the mayor was the 9th and the so-called tiebreaker vote. We adopted a series of resolutions, which I believe you have the results of. Those effectively were the recommendations. All of the recommendations that were brought forward were agreed to by a majority of the group members, but not all of them were unanimously agreed to.
Okay, so it's fair to say that this was not a unanimous decision?
They were not. Some of the resolutions, I think, were, if not unanimous, were close to that, but no, they're not. And there were disagreements, but I'd say among our various meetings, we were thoughtful, we were thorough, we were civil, we openly disagreed, and many times we, thankfully, we agreed. So I think the spirit of what we were all trying to achieve, we had more or less unanimity, but how we approached the recommendations that were ultimately given, we had a difference. There were differences of opinion. I'd say one of the goals in the group seemed to be that there was a concern for providing greater access to farmland in particular, not wanting to stop people that wanted to genuinely farm to live on their land, but not wanting to create a patchwork of McMansions, if you will, with just people with large pieces of land building homes and not really being serious about agricultural activity. But part of that also meant that we had to recognize that 75% roughly of the ag zone is forested and is not actually engaged in traditional agriculture. In fact, much of the forested part of the ag zone is a result of the zoning, which kept people from living on their land and therefore not farming and letting it revert back to forest. Anyway, that wasn't the primary discussion focus, but that's just a side note. In addition, we focused on how we could increase opportunities for recreational use of the land, because there are agritourism opportunities that could be gleaned and encouraged. we have a member of our group that's a professional forester and raised several good issues relating to forestry and the long-term life cycle of the forestry resource, and yet the desire to be able to live on your forested acreage as a land steward, even though you might not be producing a traditional agricultural crop. We did also have a brief discussion about the potential for planned unit developments as a potential tool for allowing some controlled development of up to 20 or 25% of a landowner's land in exchange for long-term conservation and preservation of the remaining 75%, and that the majority of the group, not all of them, felt that was a potentially compatible goal with the comprehensive plan, and that it would be both a win for the community in terms of conservation and preservation, but allow landowners to have some activity that would give them some a financial opportunity, and often in that case allow a farmer to have a small development, glean a capital gain, and use that to reinvest in the rest of the farm operation or in housing for their family on the same site. We adopted a series of resolutions. I can't remember exactly the final number. All of them were well debated. We voted on them as a group. Some passed. Most of them passed with a majority. We did have a couple that did not pass, and so they weren't. There was no recommendation advanced from that. So, like I said, and like I think other members of within this room and in the community, they know there were disagreements among the group. So, not surprisingly, just given the nature of the diversity of our backgrounds. I'd say overall, the resolutions were designed primarily, we focused on the 50% income test. I think there was pretty much unanimous agreement that needs to change. There were some members of the group that wished that there would be, if not a 50% income test, a income test, and I believe the resolution that we passed was to recommend that we adopt either the state or federal government standard for filing a Form F tax return, which is a small farmer income tax return form. And the threshold at the federal level, I believe, is $2,000, and in the state of Maine, I believe it's $1,000, but don't hold me to that exactly, but I believe that's the threshold. The group also had recommended, in the instance where landowners wish to have a farm residence, that they pass essentially a 2 out of 4 point protocol test, so that the landowner could achieve the goal within the ordinance, within the recommendation in the ordinance, that they have 2 of 4 conditions met, and those would be an amount of agricultural activity, amount of forestry activity, amount of conservation activity, and I can't remember what the 4th one was offhand, but I think you have that in the resolutions presented. And as I said, the goals were focused on the comprehensive plan, the income test, land preservation, conservation, and to help to promote avoiding classic suburban sprawl. I think that was fundamental, and I think that remains one of the concerns within the group. I would just end by saying I think we had healthy disagreements, but it was civil and mostly friendly, and there were instances of people getting together afterwards for just general discussion. So all in all, I'd say it was a very productive use of our time, and I hopefully the planning board will appreciate the resolutions that were advanced to them.
Thank you very much.
I'll wait and hold my comments till the end. Thank you.
Okay. right, thank you very much. Audrey has stepped out. Mrs. Knight has stepped out. So, how would you like to proceed? I would like us to continue by working on our framework for discussion.
So I think we've covered some general issues in the comp plan. I think that the next part was to try to frame some questions or discussion items that you guys want to further explore at the next meeting, and then hear from the public about any other issues that they think should be addressed as part of it.
All right, so as we create this framework for our discussion making, again, we're not really delving into the language, although some of it was brought up tonight in the amendment. What I really want the board to do is make sure that we understand what our responsibility is in this process, and what documents we really need to make sure our decisions are aligned with before we start looking at the amendment in earnest. And the reason I want us to do that is because I want us to look at the amendment based on what we've decided now, as opposed to wait. My worry being that if we read through the amendment and then decide what we want to focus on, we may sort of lose sight of what our responsibilities are. So I want us to nail down our responsibilities first before we sort of get into the weeds of looking at whether or not we feel the proposed text amendment is appropriate. So, I guess the first thing I'd like us to nail down is what are our non-negotiables when we make a decision. As we come across these things, we're going to develop some questions for ourselves, and then we're going to go out to the community as well as individuals from the state, natural resource protection boards, and asking them to come in. So we'll be asking them questions, but what are our non-negotiables? As we move forward, any answer that falls outside of this non-negotiable really will be deemed unacceptable.
Not addressing a reduction in the 50% income rule.
So
To reduce
so you're saying you would like,
a priority.
so reducing based on what finding?
That is, according to the gentleman here, it's simply not feasible
Okay.
in today's economy.
Okay, I think that we can entertain that. Ultimately, I think our non-negotiables are really going to need to be. I think if we move forward, I think we heard earlier that the comprehensive plan sort of gets at that, right? The idea that
The comp plan recognized that while housing should still be accessory to agriculture, that the 50% standard needed to be modernized or updated to meet today's agricultural business model.
Okay, and we'll use this as an example as we move forward these non-negotiables. I really want our non-negotiables to be tied to either current ordinance or the comp plan, because that's what we're responsible for implementing as the board. So that's the only reason I sort of belabored that point, so we could get there. If no one else has any ideas, I think one of our non-negotiables needs to be that, and as we move forward, whatever draft we send to the council does not promote residential use simply for the sake of residential use, that it must be accessory to farming. I think that should be, does anyone have an issue with that?
It would be in addition to a regular paycheck, people going out to a job or whatever.
Just making sure that the land stays farming. If you're going to
Yep.
build a house, it has to be accessory to the fact that you're farming the land.
Yeah.
You may have income coming, some other income, as most people do in any jobs, but that needs to be the fact if you're going to build there, there
Yep.
has to be farming done on that property.
think the whole concept of uncontrolled growth and urban sprawl are things we need to avoid and are non-negotiable. It doesn't mean we can't accomplish the goal of increasing the farming opportunities, and certainly supportive of that.
So it must avoid sprawl, yeah?
Well, I would say so, yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm making sure, I'm writing these down as we're going, so I want to make sure that. I think this will lead to questions as we move on. One of my questions being, what constitutes a farm under state and federal law, but also what constitutes a farm under current development trends within the ag industry. But the non-negotiable tied to that would be that I want it to, I want one of our non-negotiables to be that it promote varied agriculture, that it not favor one type of agriculture over another, so that we not favor large agriculture over small agriculture, and that as we move forward, we not favor small agriculture over large agriculture, that we.
Right.
All right, I think I got one for you. The comment about forestry, how forestry is not viewed as an agriculture use, and seemed like the latest committee favored the activity of forestry in the ag zone, unless I read that wrong. So maybe going forward in the draft amendment to address what is the proper approach to forestry in the ag zone.
So whatever we come up with must address forestry in the ag zone, all right. Do we think there are any others? Do we think this is sort of a good?
Good base for going forward.
Right, I think
that if, and I'll say this, I think that the fact that we're addressing this now is great, but, and this will be to the public also, this is not going to be the last time that this is discussed. We're trying to make changes that affect us now. Going forward, we're hoping that we'll have pieces of this or other items will come up that we'll be able to utilize to help us going forward in deciding the kind of activities that take place in the agricultural zone. This is not going to be the say-all, end-all for the agricultural zone, just the way it wouldn't be if we were talking about the industrial zone or residential zones. We're addressing certain problems, but there will be a way, we're hoping that this will lead to a way that we can address further issues down the line without quite so much contention.
Okay, if we sort of create this as our basis of non-negotiables, understanding that as we hear from the experts next week, we may say that, you know, we were way off base. Of course, we're not experts in agriculture or forestry or even commercial recreation as described in the comp plan. We may need to revise our approach. I think right now would it be helpful for us to generate a series of questions for staff that we can send to specific area experts?
Well, we could do that. We could ask questions, or we could invite to the next meeting the area or state experts that we have in this.
Well, I think we will invite them. My worry is that if we invite them without helping to give them a scope of what we would like to hear from them, that they may feel overwhelmed, or we may not hear what we want to hear. Like, for instance, the idea, and I know that it came up in the committee as well, but what does constitute a farm under state and federal law, right? What the idea, they discussed commercial natural resource use. Is commercial natural resource use defined at the state or federal level, and are there standards around that use? I think the experts can sort of elaborate, and they're the experts. They're gonna be able to look and say, hey, you know, you asked me these questions. I think you need to know these other things, but I think we need to give them at least a direction for what we're looking for.
And somebody correct me if I'm wrong, somebody from the committee, the ag committee that we had met, that we sent stuff forward to some of the state folks in regards to some of the questions we had, some of the things that we were asking them. And it's in the package. Do we want them to address what's in the package specifically then?
We've sent the draft that the council forwarded to the planning board. We've sent that to Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. They've received it. They are in the process of reviewing it and will provide feedback to this board and to the council.
I was talking about prior to this, as part of the Agricultural Commission, if we didn't send this already to somebody on the Agriculture and Conservation and Forestry.
We sent the ordinance, not a list of questions that I'm aware of.
Well, I mean, but if we have the questions covered, the stuff that was what we were looking at to give them a basis, just to say this is what the original group was looking at, part of what the original group was looking at. Could you come and give us information on this information?
No, I think you bring up an important point. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. I think a good question for us to ask is, what were the questions that were asked by these other committees formally, and what were the answers to those questions? Right? I mean, that's a matter of getting that documentation together and making sure that we invite members of those committees to come speak to that. Which is a good point, because I'm asking what constitutes a farm. Well, I know you all already asked that question, and I'm sure you guys got some answers. And so why, if we can invite you guys, I guess, to discuss that, that would be, I think, maybe better. But
And another question would be, as according to slide number 15, how many parcels of land are we going to affect?
that's an excellent question. All right. I think if we focus on some of the questions that the previous committees have asked, that might really cover most of the questions we have about the technical information. So that everyone in the public knows, and so the planning board knows, at the end of next meeting, the question that I'm going to ask each of us to pose is, as we go through, is, does this part of the amendment meet our non-negotiables, and does it match with the answers we got from experts and previous committee members about, for instance, what constitutes a farm, what constitutes recreational use, things like that, so that you guys can be thinking ahead about where we're going with this.
And a definition of farm.
Yep. Okay. Does the board feel comfortable? We didn't put too many questions on the board, but I think by going back and making sure that we review, not the findings, but going through and reviewing the specific questions that were asked by other committees, that will give us enough information to begin at least looking at some of the wording in the ordinance next meeting?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, having said that, we welcome, again, so many of you showed up. I want to make sure that we can hear from you. I would really like to know some of the questions that you have. If you have comments, please keep in mind that we are a board that is looking at this. We were not involved previously. Certainly narratives, understanding what has happened in the past is helpful, but really try to focus on input that you think can help us move forward. And because there are so many people, I'm going to pull my phone out here, and we'll stick with our normal protocol of 3 minutes. Okay, and when you come up, please speak your name into the microphone. Give us your address. As I said earlier in the meeting, these things are recorded, so we want to make sure that the information you give us is on record, and if we miss something, we can go back and review it and pick up what you said.
stampede up here.
I know, huh?
He beat it.
Somebody's got to break the ice.
Yeah. I'm William Sylvester. I live at 1128 Riverside Drive, Auburn, Maine. I was on the old AG ad hoc committee, ARPZ, we called ourselves. We ended up with a unanimous vote to create a agriculture advisory board and to someone, we hoped the planning board or somebody, to look at the 50% and the 10-acre thing. We didn't come up with a recommendation on that. Now, the executive summary that you speak of is the one from that, Eric, or is it a new one?
It's the one from the first group that was appointed by Mayor Labonte.
Okay, so that there was a vote, it was unanimous to have an agriculture advisory board, committee, steering committee, didn't know what to call it, but that was what that did. Now the next one that came along, we had a lot of rehashing of the same thing. We were told that it was just to talk about the ag zone, not anything else except the 50% and 10-acre thing. That was what we were supposed to resolve. And we never voted on that. I don't think there was any summary, or there certainly wasn't an executive summary that I'm aware of anyway, for that. And I don't know if the committee's over with or not. Nobody told us that we were done. So that's where that is. For my part, I think my problem is timing here. I don't know that there's anybody on either one of those committees that want to stay status quo, 50% and 10 acres. I think we're willing to negotiate on that. I think everybody is. But what we don't have all the answers. Forestry is 75% of this zone. It's 75% of the taxes. It's not well enough represented there. The second committee did a better job with it. But for my part, what I think this ought to do is maybe address some of these burning issues where people have waited years and years, legacy issues, some of that's important. I think that should be taken care of sooner than later. I was real disappointed in the strategic planning committees that conservation, forestry, agriculture wasn't brought up at all. It came up in the group I was in on in a recreational natural resource component, and the only thing we talked about forestry in there was how it related to skidoo trails, walking trails, access to water, that sort of thing, and I don't think any of the other committees talked about it, and here's 75% of our ag zone, and if we're talking about the whole town, it's 20,000 acres in the ag zone plus another 5 in rural residential that goes into forest land.
Thank you very much, sir. I apologize.
And for my part, I want to be abundantly clear that I wouldn't have voted for what we have sent, and that hasn't gone to forestry and conservation, that's only gone to agriculture. You need to talk to forestry too.
All right, thank you, sir.
And that's abundantly clear that I'm against that speed at which this thing traveled.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else that would like to share comments or provide information that they think will be helpful to the board?
Dan Herrick, 470 Hatch Road. I sat on the first committee, and it was unanimous to go for an agricultural advisory board. And I think one of the reasons I thought that would work is because every parcel of land has a different predicament to it. Every single landowner has a different issue with what was being proposed in the second group's ordinance. That's why it only was like 5-2, 5 against, 2 for. We talk about the 50% rule. Well, that was never really enforced from the day that got initiated in the early 60s. Because farmers' wives had to work out in order to have health insurance and feed the family. There's a whole lot of money in farming. Every farmer knows that, because we dump money into it every day. It's common cause. You can set any dollar amount you want to replace the 50% rule. Who's going to police it? That's a huge question, because it never got policed when it was put in the first time. The biggest thing is the 50% rule was based on husband and wife, because husband and wife didn't usually work on the farm. I'm living it today. Without her, I couldn't do what I'm doing. There's money in farming, I put it in every day. Some of hers. Okay? But no one is going to police $1,000, $2,000, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000. I'll show you a bill in 3 months at North Star Grain, $1,000, $1,500. Now I qualify. I can write a check to another farmer to buy hay. They can write me back a check the next week. It's not police. I wouldn't be concerned about that. Don't spend a whole lot of time on it. Put the number the state feels is true, or gospel or whatever. It doesn't matter. Not in my book. And I think a lot of people feel the same way. And as far as the 10-acre rule, that's fine too. Use any amount of acreage you want, but it has to be fair to everybody. My highest concern is our tax base. And the minute we have houses every 5 acres, you lose your hunting grounds, you lose your snowmobiling, you lose your mountain biking, your cross-country skiing, and the biggest concern is when I spread my shit across someone else's, my property, and it's within 5 acres of somebody else, are they gonna be happy? Something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Herrick. Is there anyone else that would like to speak to the board?
Good evening. My name is Kathy Shaw, and I own and operate Valley View Farm on Soapers Mill Road and Four Season Farm Market on Mill Street in Auburn. It was a delight for me to sit on this MAG-ARP committee. As Mr. Moore said, there was vigorous discussion. Not all of it was happy, not all of it was sad. I think we all recognize and clearly admit that there does need to be some change. My big concern is for the protection of farms in our open space and for conservation. We have a healthy animal population in these areas that are forested, and when we start to break those up, the animals have to move to feed, and they are going to move into our more urban areas. Planned unit development, great idea. But I've been told that